sun shines bright in the western sky, and my heart sings a happy tune.
The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window of the small homestead cabin, casting golden squares of light across the worn wooden floor and the simple table where 24-year-old Elena Martinez kneaded bread dough with practiced hands. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows. Flour dusted her forearms and apron, and her dark hair had escaped its bun in wispy strands that framed her face. She was completely absorbed in her work, her hands moving in the rhythmic pattern she had learned from her grandmother. And without thinking about it, she had begun to hum. The melody was an old Spanish folk song, one her abuela had sung while cooking, a tune about love and longing and the beauty of simple moments. Elena rarely sang or hummed when others might hear. Her late husband had told her many times that she should save such frivolous activities for when the work was done, that music was a distraction from the serious business of survival on the frontier. But Thomas had been dead for nearly a year now, and Elena was slowly rediscovering the small joys she had set aside during their brief, difficult marriage. She was so lost in her work and her music that she didn't hear the horse approach or the footsteps that paused just outside the open kitchen door. She didn't notice the shadow that fell across the threshold or the way the figure standing there had gone completely still, as if frozen by something unexpected and precious. It was only when she reached for the flour to dust her board again that Elena finally looked up and saw him, a tall man in a dark vest and white shirt, a cowboy hat shading his eyes, standing in her doorway as if he had been turned to stone. For a moment they simply stared at each other, Elena with her flour-covered hands suspended in mid-air, the stranger with an expression of such startled wonder that it made her heart skip. "I'm sorry," the man finally said, removing his hat respectfully. "I didn't mean to startle you. I was just passing by and I heard—" He trailed off, seeming unsure how to finish the sentence. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized he must have heard her humming. "I apologize if I disturbed you. I didn't realize anyone was nearby. Disturbed?" The man shook his head, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "No, quite the opposite. That melody you were humming, it's beautiful. I haven't heard that song in years." Elena studied him more carefully now, taking in details she had missed in her initial surprise. He was probably in his early 30s, handsome in a rugged way that spoke of outdoor work and honest living. His clothes were well-made but not ostentatious, quality materials that had been chosen for durability rather than display. But there was something about his bearing, a confidence and ease that suggested he was accustomed to respect and authority. "You know the song?" Elena asked, surprised. It was an old tune from her grandmother's village in Mexico, not something she would have expected a cowboy in Colorado territory to recognize. "My mother used to sing it," the man replied, his voice softening with memory. "She was from Sonora originally, came north with my father when they were young. She sang that song while she cooked. Just like you were doing, there," was something in his tone, a note of loss and longing that made Elena's heart go out to him. Despite her natural caution around strangers, "Would you like to come in for some coffee?" she found herself asking, surprising herself with the invitation. "The bread won't be ready for another hour, but I have yesterday's batch and some preserves." The man hesitated, and Elena could see him weighing propriety against desire. A single man visiting a widow alone in her home was the kind of thing that started gossip in small communities. But there was something about the way he was looking at her with respect and genuine interest rather than anything improper that made her trust her instinct. "I would like that very much," he said finally. "But I should introduce myself properly first. I'm Marcus Sinclair. I own the Silver Creek Ranch about 10 miles northeast of here." Elena felt her stomach drop slightly. Silver Creek Ranch was one of the largest spreads in 3 counties, encompassing thousands of acres and employing dozens of workers. The Sinclair family was legendary in this part of Colorado. Wealthy cattle barons who had built their empire through a combination of smart business practices and, according to some, ruthless acquisition of smaller properties. "I'm Elena Martinez," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. I'm sorry, Mr. Sinclair, but I'm not sure it would be appropriate for us to— Please, Marcus interrupted gently. I'm not here in any official capacity. I was just riding through, checking my northern boundary lines, and I heard a beautiful melody that reminded me of my mother. If my presence makes you uncomfortable, I'll leave immediately. But I'd be grateful for just a few minutes of your time and perhaps a cup of that coffee you mentioned there. Was something in his voice, a genuine loneliness beneath the polite words that made Elena reconsider. She thought about her own isolation on this small homestead, the way she had been spending her days working alone with only her thoughts and memories for company. Come in, she said, making her decision. Sit at the table and I'll pour you some coffee. As Marcus settled into one of the simple wooden chairs at her kitchen table, Elena busied herself with the coffee pot and cups, acutely aware of his presence in her small space. He seemed too large for the modest cabin, not in physical size, but in some intangible way that had to do with confidence and authority and the kind of presence that came from being accustomed to commanding others' attention. How long have you lived here? Marcus asked as Elena set a cup of strong black coffee in front of him. 2 years. My husband Thomas and I came here from Santa Fe. He wanted to try farming rather than ranching. Thought there was opportunity in raising crops for the mining towns. Elena heard the slight bitterness in her own voice and tried to soften it. He died last year in an accident with one of the machines. I'm sorry for your loss, Marcus said, and the sincerity in his voice made Elena look up at him sharply. That must have been very difficult. It was. It is. Elena returned to her bread dough, needing something to do with her hands. But life continues whether we're ready for it or not. Marcus watched her work for a moment, and there was something mesmerizing about the efficient, practiced movements of her hands. Do you still farm? I try. I have about 40 acres under cultivation. Beans, squash, some wheat. It's not much, but it keeps me busy and brings in enough to cover my basic expenses. That's impressive. Most people couldn't manage that alone. Elena shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. I do what I must. They fell into a surprisingly comfortable silence, Elena working her dough while Marcus sipped his coffee. After a few minutes, Marcus spoke again. Would you mind if I asked you to hum that song again? The one you were singing when I arrived? Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks again, but there was something in his expression, a vulnerability she wouldn't have expected from a wealthy rancher, that made her agree. Softly at first, then with growing confidence, she began to hum the old melody her grandmother had taught her. She watched as Marcus closed his eyes, his face softening with memory and emotion. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before opening his eyes and looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch. Thank you, he said quietly. I haven't thought about my mother in a long time. Not really thought about her, I mean. I've been so focused on expanding the ranch and living up to my father's legacy that I'd forgotten what she taught me about what really matters. What did she teach you? Elena asked, genuinely curious. Marcus considered the question seriously. She taught me that success means nothing if you're alone at the end of the day. That a beautiful meal shared with someone you care about is worth more than all the cattle in Colorado. That music and laughter and the small domestic rituals of daily life are what make a house into a home. He looked around Elena's modest kitchen with new appreciation. Your home is beautiful, Elena. Not because of the furnishings or the size, but because it feels lived in and loved. That's something I haven't had in my life for a very long time. Elena was surprised by his candor. Surely you have family at the Silver Creek Ranch. I have employees. I have business associates. I have people who depend on me for their livelihoods. Marcus's voice carried a note of resignation. But I don't have what my parents had, that partnership, that genuine connection that makes all the hard work worthwhile. Elena found herself setting down her bread dough and sitting across from Marcus at the table. Why are you telling me this? You don't even know me. Because you remind me of what I've been missing without even realizing it. Because hearing you hum while you work reminded me of what a home should feel like. Marcus met her eyes directly. And because you're the first person in years who's looked at me like I'm a person rather than a source of business opportunities or social advancement. Elena felt something shift in her chest. She understood exactly what he meant. Since Thomas's death, most of the men who had approached her had been interested either in her 40 acres or in finding someone to keep their house and warm their bed. No one had been interested in her as a person, in her thoughts and dreams, and the music she carried in her heart. "I should probably get back to my work," Marcus said, though he made no move to rise. "But would you mind if I stopped by again sometime?" "Perhaps when I'm checking the boundary lines?" Elena knew she should probably say no. Entertaining visits from one of the wealthiest men in the territory was likely to start gossip and could complicate her already difficult situation. But there was something about Marcus Sinclair that called to her, not his wealth or his status, but the loneliness she recognized in his eyes, the hunger for genuine human connection that mirrored her own. "I'm usually baking on Wednesday and Saturday mornings," she said carefully. "If you happen to be checking your boundaries on one of those days, I suppose it wouldn't be inappropriate to offer coffee to a neighbor." Marcus's smile was like sunrise, transforming his entire face. "I believe I'll be needing to check those northern boundaries quite frequently for the foreseeable future." Over the following weeks, Marcus did indeed find reasons to check his northern boundaries with remarkable frequency. Each visit followed a similar pattern. He would arrive in the morning, drawn by the sound of Elena's humming, and they would share coffee while she worked. They talked about everything and nothing, discovering shared interests and complementary perspectives on life and work and the challenges of surviving on the frontier. Marcus proved to be nothing like Elena's expectations of a wealthy rancher. He was knowledgeable about farming techniques and genuinely interested in her crops, offering suggestions that came from practical experience rather than theoretical book learning. He listened when she talked about her dreams of expanding her small farm, and he treated her opinions with a respect that Thomas had never shown. Elena found herself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. She began to time her baking so that she would be working when Marcus might arrive, and she caught herself humming more frequently, hoping the music would draw him to her door. It was on a Wednesday in late summer, nearly 3 months after their first meeting, that everything changed. Elena was making bread as usual, humming her grandmother's song, when Marcus arrived. But this time, instead of sitting at the table, he stood close to her work surface, watching her hands as they kneaded the dough. "Elena," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Elena's hands stilled, and she looked up at him with sudden apprehension. "What is it?" "I've been coming here under false pretenses." "Not entirely false," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "Everything I've told you about myself and my feelings has been true. But I need you to know that my interest in your property has nothing to do with my interest in you." Elena felt her stomach clench. "What do you mean, your interest in my property?" Marcus pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Your husband took out a loan from my father 3 years ago to buy farming equipment. The loan was called in 6 months ago, but the bank never received payment." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas had mentioned something about a loan before he died, but she had assumed it had been paid off or forgotten. "How much is owed?" $800 plus accumulated interest. It was a fortune, more money than Elena would see in 5 years of farming. "I don't have that kind of money." "I know. Most people in your situation would lose their property to foreclosure. But I'm not here to collect the debt, Elena. I'm here to forgive it." Elena stared at him in shock. "Why would you do that?" "Because I've fallen in love with you," Marcus said simply. "Because the sound of your humming has become the brightest part of my week. Because you've shown me what's been missing from my life, and I can't imagine going back to the emptiness I was living in before I met you." Elena felt tears spring to her eyes. "Marcus, I don't want your charity. I don't want you to forgive my debt out of pity or obligation." "It's not charity or pity," Marcus said, moving closer until he was standing directly in front of her. "I'm forgiving the debt because I want you to be free to choose. I want you to choose whether to stay here on your farm or to come with me to Silver Creek Ranch. I want you to choose whether to marry me or to remain independent. But I need you to make that choice freely, without the weight of debt hanging over you." Elena looked into his eyes and saw the truth of his words reflected there. This wasn't about power or acquisition or adding her 40 acres to his thousands. This was about a man who had been reminded of what really mattered by the simple sound of humming in a kitchen. "What if I choose to stay here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I'll respect your choice and continue checking my northern boundaries with remarkable frequency, hoping that someday you might feel the same way I do." Elena looked down at her flour-covered hands, thinking about all the mornings she had spent working alone in this kitchen, all the days when the only voice she heard was her own. She thought about the difference between the lonely isolation she had felt before Marcus started, visiting, and the warm anticipation she now felt each Wednesday and Saturday morning. "I do feel the same way," she admitted, looking back up at him. "I've been afraid to acknowledge it because of who you are and who I am. Because I thought you couldn't possibly be interested in someone like me." "Someone like you?" Marcus repeated, his voice filled with wonder. "Elena, you're exactly who I need in my life. Not because of what you can do for me, but because of who you are. Strong, independent, creative, kind. Because you hum while you work, and you make the simplest domestic tasks feel like celebrations of life." He reached out and gently touched her flour-covered hand. "Marry me, Elena. Not because of debt or obligation or social advantage, but because we found something rare and precious together. Because you remind me what home should feel like, and I want to spend the rest of my life listening to you hum in our kitchen." Elena felt tears stream down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and sure. "Yes, I'll marry you." Marcus pulled her into his arms, flour and all, and kissed her with a tenderness that took her breath away. When they finally broke apart, both were laughing and crying at the same time. "I should probably warn you," Elena said, wiping flour off Marcus's shirt with an apologetic smile. "I come with 40 acres of farmland that will need managing, and I have very strong opinions about crop rotation and irrigation methods." "I should probably warn you," Marcus replied, "that I come with a ranch that employs 50 people, business concerns that stretch across 3 territories, and an insufferable habit of checking my northern boundaries multiple times a week." "I think I can live with that," Elena said, reaching up to kiss him again. They were married 6 weeks later in a ceremony that brought together 2 very different communities. Elena's farmer neighbors from the small homestead surrounding her property, and Marcus's ranch hands and business associates from across the territory. Elena wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, and she carried wildflowers from her own garden. But what everyone remembered most about the wedding was the moment during the reception when Elena began to hum her grandmother's song, and Marcus took her hand and led her in a dance across the wooden floor of the community hall. Elena divided her time between her original homestead, which she continued to farm with the help of hired workers, and the Silver Creek Ranch, where she brought warmth and music to spaces that had been beautiful but empty for too long. She taught the ranch cook her grandmother's recipes, organized regular gatherings where employees and their families could share meals and laughter, and filled the ranch house with the sounds of humming and singing that Marcus had been missing since his mother's death. But her favorite times were still Wednesday and Saturday mornings, when she would work in her kitchen, sometimes at the homestead, sometimes at the ranch, kneading bread and humming old songs while Marcus sat at the table drinking coffee and watching her with the same wonder he had shown that first morning, when he heard her melody and stopped to listen. Years later, their children would grow up listening to their mother hum while she worked, learning the old songs and the new ones she created, and Marcus would tell them the story of how he had been riding past a small homestead, checking his boundary lines as usual, when he heard a sound so beautiful that it stopped him in his tracks and changed his life forever. "Your mother's humming saved me," he would say, his arm around Elena's waist as they stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "It reminded me what I was working so hard for, what really matters in life. Not land or cattle or success, but the simple joy of sharing your days with someone who makes even the ordinary moments feel like music." Elena would smile and lean into her husband's embrace, grateful for the day she had been brave enough to hum in her kitchen, and grateful for the man who had been wise enough to stop and listen. If This story of finding love through simple moments of authenticity touched your heart and reminded you that sometimes our most powerful attractions come not from grand gestures, but from the everyday music of genuine living. Please share it with someone who needs to remember that they are seen and valued for who they truly are. Your support helps us continue creating stories that celebrate the beautiful truth that the right person will hear the melody of your soul even when you think no one is listening. Subscribe for more tales that remind us all that love often begins when we're brave enough to be fully ourselves. Thank you for being part of our storytelling family.